All right. Looks like we've got some good numbers. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you everyone for joining again for another Docents webinar. Today is the final webinar in the 2024 webinar series. We have today with us Dr. Sander van Benda-Beckmann from the Netherlands Organization of Applied Scientific Research, or TNO, as some of you may know that organization. I will come back and introduce Sander as well as his background and talk. But before we get into that, I just have some housekeeping topics to discuss with everyone, just so we're all on the same page about this webinar and how to navigate the chat box functions. If you're joining us over Zoom, you should see something like this on the bottom of your screen. You should have a tab for audio settings. So if you are a person who likes to watch with closed captioning or subtitles, they are enabled, and you can enable them or turn them on for yourself there. And then notice we have a chat box and a Q&A panel button. We have distinct use of these throughout the webinar. So if you click on the Q&A panel button, a box should appear on your screen like this. The Q&A is for you to ask questions to our speaker as well as our panelists. Myself, Kathy, and Joao will try to answer these questions as quickly as possible throughout the webinar. If we don't get to them throughout the webinar, we will have some time at the end for Q&A with our speaker, and we will follow up with these questions at the end after the webinar concludes. So this function is for you to ask questions directly about the webinar. These are the ones that the panelists and the speaker will see and respond to. For everything else, please use the chat box. And then if you're joining us over YouTube, we don't have a Q&A functionality for YouTube, but your input still matters and still counts. So if you have a question and you're watching over YouTube, just pop it in the chat box, and our panelists will get that copied over into the Q&A chat function, so that way we can all see and respond to that as well. So that's it for housekeeping. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Sander van Benda-Beckmann. Sander has a background in computational cosmology and has been working in the field of sonar for a number of years. He's a very accomplished researcher and has been awarded the A.B. Wood Medal from the UK Institute of Acoustics for his accomplishments researching the impacts of sound on marine life. He's here today to talk to us about impulsive sound in offshore wind and the impacts of that noise on marine ecosystems. So with that, I'd like to stop sharing and let Sander take control.
Thank you, Christian. Let me just share my screen. So if all is well, you should be able to see my presentation.
Yep, we can see it.
Great. So thank you very much. So my name is Sander van Benda-Beckmann. I work at the Acoustic Sensor Sonar Systems Department of TNO in the Netherlands. And yeah, I'll be talking about impulsive sound and offshore wind. And first of all, I would like to thank the Docents team for inviting me to give this presentation. I think the Docents website is really valuable resource for finding information on the topics of underwater noise. And yeah, I'm happy to contribute. So I'll provide a brief outline of my presentation. So I'll briefly touch on what we know about the effects of underwater noise and what we are worried about. And then I'll go and introduce kind of the developments of offshore wind just to set the scene. And I'll be talking a bit more about impulsive sound and why we think it matters. And then I want to show you some examples of where we study the impacts of offshore wind on marine life, mainly on marine mammals, and experience that we have in Europe, especially in the North Sea area where I'm based mostly. And I think I want to touch on 3 points. So one is understanding the effects of impulsive sounds on hearing of marine mammals, how we deal with the effects and consequence of impulsive sound on behavior, and also briefly talk about development of noise guidelines in the European Union. So we all know that sound in water is important for animals to communicate, orient, and find food. And almost all species that we study in the marine environment can perceive sound on the water. And in a recent review, Duarte et al. In 2021, they paint this picture where animals have evolved in a pristine environment, and as more and more anthropogenic activity has been developing, there's more sound being introduced into the water that might affect the animals on the water. And if we look at the studies that have been done on all these different taxonomic groups and species, you basically see in a lot of these different species that there are significant effects of noise being found. And also in the Duarte paper, they kind of paint this picture where they wonder, okay, are we continuing these effects of underwater noise on the environment, or are we doing things to reduce these impacts? And of course, this topic really deals with how can we actually manage the impacts of underwater noise on the marine environment. So what types of effects are we typically worried about? I think the DOSIT's website provides a lot of nice background on this, but typically, loud sounds might induce hearing damage or temporarily affect the hearing sensitivity of animals. There's lots of different types of behavioral responses that we see in marine animals. And there's also effects like masking and stress that are probably more hard to measure directly, but still might affect these animals. And when we think about these behavioral effects, also or any impact actually, we're really worried about effects that impact vital behavior or vital rates of these animals. So, for instance, cessation of feeding, whether they affect breeding, parental care, avoidance of habitats, etc. And because of all of this, you see a lot of development of regulation and guidelines to manage noise pollution, which is really an active field and in rapid development, I would say, as new science is becoming available. So when we look at offshore wind, a lot of countries are developing offshore wind as a way to look for alternative green energies. And the projection of the Global Offshore Wind Council is that by early 2030s, worldwide, we will be about 410 of gigawatts being developed. And these figures that I show here are kind of, I got from Skin Wind Analytics, and this shows you from different geographical areas, plans or potential plans and projections into the future of offshore wind sites. And you really see that it's a global issue. And there's a large ambition, and there will be significant change in some of these areas where these in habitat also where these wind farms are being developed. So I'm here based in the Netherlands, which is a kind of the northern part of Europe for those unfamiliar with the Netherlands, and we're located here at the North Sea, which is a busy sea. And as you see, there's lots of ambitions for offshore wind in that area. So if we zoom in a bit more into that area, The current ambition for offshore wind in this area currently is about 123 gigawatts, where about 21 of that is expected to be currently being planned to be developed in the Dutch part of the Netherlands part of the North Sea. And it also looks like those ambitions will be increased as we move towards the future. So the trends that we see in the North Sea is that there's an increasing number of countries that have imposed noise restrictions, mainly during the construction phase of offshore wind. So typically, these wind turbines are being piled using pile driving into the seabed, which creates a lot of loud impulsive sounds, which I'll talk about a bit later. And into the future, we see a trend that there will be increasing pile diameters being built with larger hammers being needed, also increasing water depths, and there will be challenges to meet those criteria that are currently imposed on the industry. We also see a shift or broadening, I would say, from attention to the construction phase, also to the operational phase, where questions are being asked, how does the habitat actually change? Do animals actively avoid or possibly increase the use of that habitat in these areas? And at the same time, we also see that alternative construction techniques, besides the kind of conventional, I would say, pile driving, like vibratory piling, jetting, or combined with jetting or floating wind, are being thought of, slowly being introduced in the near future, or in some locations already. So pile driving is not the only sound in the North Sea. The North Sea is quite busy. This slide just gives you an overview of what we consider the big five of dominant sound sources in the North Sea environment. And I'll just play you some examples. So just a heads up for those who have headphones, might be a bit loud. So I'll give you a bit of time maybe to adjust your headphone just to make sure. So this example will show you pile driving. So this is just a repetitive impulsive sound source. So the next example will show you seismics. So this was a more distant pulse. Typically, it's more continuous. And this example is an underwater explosion measured from a distance. My final example is Sonar sound, which I'm trying to play. Does it work? Sec. So typically, sonar sounds transmit a brief signal, tonal sweep or a sweep signal, with some pause in between. So if we look at this signal, this is just an example waveform of pile driving sound of one of those pulses zoomed in. So the time is about 1 second time, and you see the duration of that pulse is quite short, about 100, 200 milliseconds in this case. And there's different ways how to characterize this sound. So you can look at the peak sound pressure. So this is basically the highest peak of that wave form. The sound exposure level, which is basically the total energy in that pulse. And you can look at it from a pulse perspective, or also accumulated energy over a larger number of pulses. You can look at the sound pressure level, which is just the average of that pressure over some time period. There's also other metrics. One is kurtosis, which I'll explain a bit later for the rise time of the pulse duration. So there's lots of different ways how to characterize these pulses. Another thing to realize is that we believe, or we know, that the frequency content of that pulse is going to be important as well. So animals might be sensitive to different types of frequencies or frequency ranges. So in order to deal with that, we typically apply frequency weighting. So that kind of emphasizes the frequency components of the signal to which animals are mostly sensitive to. So if you talk about impulsive sound, what do we actually mean? And actually, what you find is that different people mean different things by impulsive sound. I think a common definition that is adopted, which is based on the Southall et al. Criteria, noise criteria, which these are noise criteria that have been developed for impact of hearing, sound on hearing on marine mammals, where a distinction is being made by pulse sounds and non-pulse sounds, where pulse sounds are typically brief, broadband, and atonal transient signal. And non-pulses can be transient signals, but they lack these essential properties of pulses, such as a rapid rise time. And for instance, pile driving sounds, ergon sounds, and explosions would be considered pulse sounds under this definition, whereas sonar sounds, which are intermittent, are non-pulse sounds. And why does it matter? So these impact criteria that have been developed for hearing impact, they differ by a lot between pulse and non-pulse sounds. If we look, for instance, at the European Union, people look at impulse sounds and try to look at the larger picture of cumulative impacts of impulsive sound sources. And in their definition of impulse sounds, sonar is also considered as a non-pulse, as an impulsive sound. So that's just good to kind of keep in the back of our minds, that when we talk about impulsive sound sources, people might mean different things. So for hearing impact, there's some definitions. For behavioral impacts, we don't really have a kind of a commonly accepted criteria that relates to impact. So lots of different metrics are being used: sound exposure level, with or without frequency weighting, sound pressure level, peak sound pressure level, or some frequency weighted sound pressure level, average over short duration. So typically the integration time of the hearing, or also, which is also referred to as LP fast. And another thing to realize is that some of these sound sources that are considered impulsive, because they're kind of, when you're relatively close to the source, are these brief transients. As they propagate, as that sound propagates through the medium, that pulse gets stretched and the frequency content changes due to the propagation of the sound. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment about when to apply what kind of noise criteria, impact criteria to these different sounds, and that has a lot of implications for, what our estimated risk is for hearing damage, for instance, for marine mammals. So when we look at the North Sea, there's a special concern that we have is for the harbor porpoise. This is considered to be a sensitive animal to underwater noise. It's also a very abundant species in the North Sea, and its habitat overlaps with a lot of offshore wind areas. And basically, a lot of the regulation is being developed around these species, with the idea that if you manage to avoid impacts on these species, that you automatically also will help other species that might be less sensitive. And I'll be talking a bit more about some of the studies that we have been doing at this particular species. So first, I want to talk a bit about work that we've done to predict risk of hearing damage or hearing impact of impulsive and intermittent sounds on a harbor porpoise. So when we look at these impulse sounds, so one of the main impact criteria that people are currently considering is the sound exposure level. So that's the total energy in that pulse, and then weighted for the frequency sensitivity of a particular species, in this case, for instance, the harbor porpoise. So those criteria are typically based on measurements that have been carried out by different groups, where you basically measure what we call the TTS, or temporary threshold shift, which is a recoverable reduction in the hearing sensitivity of animals. And on the right panel here, this shows you a graph from a review from Jim Finneran. Basically shows how the growth of this TTS changes with increasing sound exposure level. And these different panels show you different types of sounds to which animals were exposed. These are curves for harbor porpoises. And I just want to highlight, so these are basically the data underlying these noise criteria that are commonly used, also in the Southall et al. 2019 criteria. And there's a number of things that you can see from these graphs that are highlighted. So on the top one, you basically see a comparison for more tonal sonar-like signals, where the black dots indicate a continuous sequence of these signals, and the open curves show you intermittent signals. And you basically see that intermittent pulses, even if they have the same frequency content and total energy, the TTS growth is less. If we look on the middle right column, this is a kind of a graph for impulsive sound. So this is typically like airgun playbacks, for instance. And you see that the growth rate is different for impulsive sounds. And this is also kind of the underlying data that leads to different noise criteria, basically, for impulsive versus pulse sounds. But you see that intermittent pulses tend to have lower risk than continuous pulses at the same sound exposure level. So what we asked ourselves is, can we develop growth models that better deal with impulsiveness of the sound, so that you don't really have to make maybe an arbitrary distinction between sound categories, but really use some of the characteristics of the sound to relate that to the risk of hearing effects. And we're also interested to see, okay, can we make models that can deal with the intermittent nature of sounds? And we did the study that we carried out in collaboration with Ron Kastelein at CMARCO in the Netherlands, and also with Darlene Ketten, where we studied impacts of airgun sounds of miniature airguns on TTS growth in porpoises, which we then combined also with pilot driving playbacks with the same animals, and also sonar playbacks. So different kinds of noises. So this is a bit of a complex slide, and I don't mean to explain every detail, but I think what I want to highlight with this slide, in a recent review that we did, it's just published in the Aquatic Noise special issue, is that there's lots of different underlying mechanisms that can cause the growth of TTS and also PTS or other forms of hearing damage, such as degradation of the neurons that transmit the signals into the brain, and depending on whether sounds are more long duration, you would expect a more chronic exposure, and if the sound levels of these signals increase in intensity, you get other types of effects that start to happen. And when we were looking for kind of motivation for the models, we were looking into the biomechanical effects that were happening, just to see, is there something we can base these models on? And we were basically concluded that we still have to rely on correlations between exposure characteristics and effects, because these underlying mechanisms are just too complex and too diverse. And lots of these different mechanisms might be at play at the same time. So we have to look for other ways how to build these models. So what we looked at more in the literature for human studies, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment when we look at the effects of impulse sound on human hearing, whether kurtosis can help better predict a risk of hearing impact. And kurtosis, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, it's basically a statistical measure of the peakedness of the signal. I mean, we can write out the mass here, but it's basically a statistical measure of the sound. On the right here, I show you an example of the Zhao et al. Paper where you see the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss in a group of factory workers as a function of the total noise exposure on the top for two different types of noise environments. One which had more impulsive sound intermingled with the noise, and another environment with less impulsive sound. You see that the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss is higher if there's more complex noise with more impulsive sound in it. Whereas if you correct for the kurtosis of that sound, those two are much more consistent with each other. And there's different studies looking at different data sets and proposing different ways how to incorporate kurtosis into these on top of the sound exposure level to better predict these risk of hearing effects. So we thought, okay, it would be interesting. Let's try that out with the porpoise data that we have to see whether we can better predict this TTS growth for these different types of noise conditions with different types of kurtosis. So this is a study we published in 2022, where we basically show the TTS growth, so the growth of the temporary threshold shift, as a function of different noise metrics. So on the top left, that's basically the sound exposure level, just as it is. And on the top right, that's a sound exposure level, including frequency weighting, because these are different types of signals. We included sonar signals at 1.5 and 6.5 kilohertz. We included airgun playbacks or airgun exposures, and also pile driving playbacks. So these are signals with different frequency content, different intermittency, and duration. And what we found was that if you look on the right middle panel, that one of these kurtosis corrected sound exposure levels really provides a fairly good fit for lots of these different types of noise conditions. And we found a slightly different parameter, fitting parameter, that was different from that has been reported for human and chinchilla noise exposures. Sorry. But we didn't necessarily expect the same relationship, mainly because there's a lots of differences in the types of data that we're and also species that we look at. For instance, here we look at low levels of temporary threshold shift, whereas these other studies really look at permanent hearing damage. We have fairly short duration exposures of maybe a couple of hours at max, versus these long duration exposures of factory workers, for instance, that might occur over years. Also, porpoises are high frequency echolocating species that might have adapted hearing, and also I think an important difference is that these studies look at more continuous noise with different degrees of impulsiveness, whereas we look at intermittent signals, so where there's a signal and a break in between them. And I'll get back to that also in my next slide. So this looks promising, I would say, but at the same time, I also want to caution about using this really straight away into, for instance, regulatory frameworks, for instance, because this is really done on a few animals and with few replications. So we really, in order to test these models, we really need to test this on a wider range of species. And just one of the make one point about where this kind of obvious misuse of kurtosis might happen is that if we compare, for instance, the intermittent sonar with continuous sonar, so it's basically the same signal, same energy, but then the intermittent signals basically have a pause of 9 seconds in between them. And you so that signal will have a higher kurtosis, the intermittent signal, but we actually see that the growth is slower. And also, if you start to impose these kurtosis correction factors, basically you make that the relationship between these corrected metrics with predicted TTS much worse. And the reason for this is that what we're ignoring here in such a metric where we use sound exposure level and kurtosis in combination, we're ignoring the fact that there's hearing recovery during silent periods. So that's something that kurtosis is not capturing, and you're actually comparing apples and oranges. So that's really also another caveat to keep in the back when you think about kurtosis. So in the next step, we thought about, okay, the recovery is apparently also important. So this is just a kind of a schematic illustration of how that works. You have a number of these black blocks basically in time show you the sound exposure. So you have a sound with a certain sound pressure level that's being repeated every so much time, and the TTS then slowly builds up over the time, but there will be recovery in between, and then up to the point at the end, at the black dot, that's actually the time where you actually measure the TTS in the animal. So what we tried is to look in the literature, are there models that can allow us to incorporate these recovery factors in these growth models? And we ended up with the so-called modified power law model. That's a model that's been introduced by Humans and Jested in the 90s to look at the effects of masking and also, or addition of masking and also addition of threshold shifts. And that's also been applied more recently by Jim Finneran in 2010 with dolphins, which provided an interesting framework to see how different exposures or the accumulation of different exposures, how they would end up over time. And basically what the model tells you is that there is the contribution of a single exposure, the amount of threshold shift, how it ends up if you do this n times, how it ends up with the threshold of the previous exposures and account for some recovery, and that it will be added up with some power law. That's why it's called a power law model. And we managed to fit this data to or this model to our porpoise data. In this case, we were looking at continuous and intermittent sonar signals, for which we had the largest range of different sound pressure levels and exposure durations. And that seemed to work pretty well for a wide range of exposure conditions. So that's quite interesting. But I do have to say that it's with those parameters, it was still hard to match the growth of using different noise conditions like pile driving or airgun exposures. But I think it's a kind of interesting venue to explore more, and there's also reasons why we think these models can be improved. So just to summarize that part, so models are being explored to predict the effect of impulsiveness or TTS growth. I think kurtosis correction, there seems to be seems to pretty well predict TTS growth for a wide range of intermittent sound types in porpoises in the data set that we've looked at so far. But I still caution against using this until this has been tested more with more individuals and other species. And I think the other conclusion is that this modified power law model might be a useful model to explore TTS growth for different types of intermittent and exposure conditions. And in the end, ideally you would like to have a model that just where you can include different types of noise conditions and then predict TTS instead of having to make categorizations of different noise types. So with that, I'd like to switch to behavioral disturbance and also in relation to offshore wind development. And I want to show you some of the findings that we have that we're finding here in the North Sea in how porpoises respond to piling, and also how we use those findings to develop noise guidelines in the Netherlands. So several studies have shown already over the past 10 years, I would say, or 15 years, that porpoises can be disturbed up to really large distances due to piling. And typically what you see is that there's an avoidance response and also reduction of echolocation clicks that you can detect using passive acoustic monitoring. And also aerial surveys and also indicate that the animals are actually leaving the area. And I think the important thing to realize here is that once you really start producing lots of sound in the underwater environment, it's really hard to completely avoid disturbing any animal. But the big question, of course, is, okay, how much disturbance are the animals able to cope with? And also that means how much noise restriction should I impose on the industry? So that's kind of the balance that we have to make, that we try to get at with these studies. So this is just an example of a project that was carried out recently. So this is data collected by Waterproof and Wageningen Marine Research, where this was for an offshore wind farm that was built recently off the coast of the Netherlands, where on the right side you see basically all the piling locations, and the circles indicate positions of acoustic recording sites with some of them, and also stars indicate location with CPOTs, which is basically an acoustic click detector that are commonly being used to detect presence of harbor porpoises. And basically the signal that you're looking for is ultrasonic echolocation clicks that indicate foraging of harbor porpoises. And the effect that you see from, for instance, from piling is that you would see a reduction in number of clicks and also the time that you see clicks in a certain area, which then indicates avoidance and or cessation of echolocation. And we were involved in this study where we were doing the acoustic modeling, and basically in the end you combine the reduction of clicks in relation to distance or associated modeled received levels, which then you can use to create those response relationships. And those are really valuable if you want to project into the future, because we have these ambition and plans for the coming decade, where we want to build all this offshore wind, and we want to understand, okay, how much disturbance is that going to cost? These types of monitoring studies are being done in different countries around the North Sea for these species, and also in the Baltic Sea, for instance. So here is just a comparison of two different wind farms. On the left is a Gemini wind farm which has been constructed earlier during a period where there weren't any noise restrictions yet. So that's kind of pile driving without noise reduction measures. And on the right side is the figure where the recent wind farm that I just mentioned was constructed, that had noise reduction noise limits imposed. So there was a lot of measures taken to do noise mitigation, like bubble screens and near field mitigation measures. And what you see is the reduction in probability of detecting porpoises. And you see that there's, for the unmitigated situation, there's a statistical reduction, significant reduction, starting from 15 kilometers, whereas the mean actually goes even up to 40 kilometers, median, I should say, of the distribution. Whereas in the mitigated case, you really see that is being reduced by down to 7 kilometers and potentially up to 16 kilometers. And Waterproof Wageningen Marine Research and TNO published a report about this in 2022, which you can find online if you're interested. So this shows you just that by imposing noise restriction measures, there's a real reduction also in the amount of disturbance that is caused. And this is also consistent with earlier findings in Germany. It just serves to illustrate how we actually measure the impacts of these impulses on harbor porpoises. There's quite a bit of discussion about how do we predict into the future and what kind of metrics are most appropriate to do that. And one of the things that is currently being discussed is how the frequency content of these pulses, how they affect these animals. So noise reduction measures not only reduce overall the levels, but they also tend to reduce more effectively higher frequency content of these pulses. And also, if sound propagates out to larger distances, also that high frequency get attenuated by absorption in the water. Just to test that hypothesis, for instance, these graphs show you playback spectra that Ron Kastelein used in a study in 2022, where they played back these signals with the same broadband energy, sound exposure level. But then if you look at the bottom panel, it shows you where you account for the frequency sensitivity of these animals. So you apply these weighting, that these different spectra with the same broadband energy, they have these very different weighted energy or sound exposure level. So what you can see is that actually there's a reduction if you have signals that are more weighted, so there's less frequency content in there, animals respond less to the sound. And it's also consistent with earlier predictions from Tugart et al., for instance, in 2015, and also in some of the earlier ergon studies that we did, where we had animals where we used bubble plastics to screen off the high frequency content during behavioral response studies of porpoises with ergons. So we tried to look at in the monitoring campaign that I just described during the offshore wind construction. We tried to see whether we could see this effect. So if we could explain the reduced or the amount of disturbance better with frequency weighted metrics than with broadband sound exposure levels, for instance. And unfortunately, that analysis was inconclusive. I'm saying unfortunately, but perhaps I should say fortunately, because the noise mitigation measures were so effective that all of the high frequencies were basically filtered out in such a way that you were only detecting background noise from the environment. So we couldn't actually properly measure the frequency weighted spectra properly. But I think all these captive studies and also comparative studies from Tugart et al. Just I think really are very indicative that frequency content really matters for these animals, even though we couldn't show it using the field data. So if we look more internationally, so this is really more kind of the Dutch, what I've been talking about, more the Dutch focus. If you look at more internationally, you see that there's different approaches how to establish noise criteria, and that they vary by nation, at least in the North Sea area, I would say. And some countries base them on want to avoid hearing injury, and other nations also worry about hearing injury, but kind of base their noise criteria more on behavioral disturbance. And as I described earlier, these monitoring campaigns are happening in different locations, most of them focusing on porpoises. And what they seem to find is that there's different impact sizes for these different fields. In some locations they find smaller effect distances, even if there's no mitigation, than other sites. And I think part of that is sometimes hard to compare the outcomes of these studies because there's no real standardized format how to quantify the impact or the reduction in impact between these sites. But I think it's also possible that disturbance will differ by area, and that other metrics that are different or besides acoustics, like prey availability perhaps, or other factors are also likely to matter. And I think that just shows you the importance that it's good to continue monitoring, and it's not just a one-off monitoring, and you can just apply it to every other location. So that's something to keep in the back of the head. I think besides all these complications, I think it's just worthwhile just to point out noise reduction does work in reducing behavioral disturbance, and also that noise reduction also likely reduces the impacts of other species. As I said, there's a trend also to other types of construction activities, and I think this is also applies more broadly than just offshore wind, where you see this in lots of different sectors. You see impulsive sound sources or loud intermittent sound sources like pile driving, air guns, and pulse active sonars being replaced or partially replaced or complemented with other types of sounds which are more continuous, maybe perhaps at the lower peak levels, but more continuously radiating sounds. And I think there's a lot of questions at the moment of how do we translate all the findings that we find for these impulsive sound sources? Is there less disturbance, for instance, to these new types of sound sources compared to pulse sounds? Yeah, I think there's a lot of activity going on trying to better get a grip on these new types of sound sources. And I think some recent studies that we did, for instance, with continuous active sonar just highlights that it's not as straightforward as if there's a reduction in peak levels, then there's a reduction in disturbance. It actually is more complicated than that. So I think there's definitely something to look out for.
I just want to jump in here and say we have 5 minutes left in the webinar.
I'm almost done. So I want to finish with how do we make sense of the disturbance that we're seeing, and there's this framework being proposed over the past decade about how you can deal with translate population or effects of disturbance into population dynamics, where you basically try to look at what's the impact on individuals, how does changes in physiology and behavior change, for instance, vital rates that can then potentially translate into population dynamics. And in the Netherlands, we've developed a framework that we developed for the noise guidelines. Is actually based on this kind of population consequence or PCOT framework. And what we basically do is we project the planned activities up to 23. We do noise modeling, use what we know from those response relationships from these monitoring sites to predict how many numbers of animals are being disturbed. And we are using what's called the interim PCOT model, which is a model that's been developed in St. Andrews. And this is basically a model that uses expert elicitation, basically expert estimates of how sound would affect vital rates of these animals, and then propagates that through a population model, population dynamics model, to estimate how big of an impact this would be on the population. And then by comparing that outcome of that model to conservation objectives by our government, we basically convert that back into noise criteria. And that's actually the criteria that are being used for future offshore wind developments. If we look more wider about how European Union is trying to deal with this, with impulsive noise in general, there's a kind of a trend to look more at cumulative impacts of sound sources. So not just consider offshore wind on its own, but also consider it in combination with other impulsive sound sources. So these are air guns, sonars, piling, etc. And basically, there's noise registers being set up on regional scales to first map where and how long that disturbance or disturbing activities are occurring. So you can look at trends and percentage of habitats that are being affected. At the same time, on an even wider scale, there's been a EU technical group that's recently provided advice on how to set thresholds for impulsive noise, where they basically come up with two thresholds. One kind of as a short-term exposure, basically saying that the area that you should affect on a daily basis should be less than 20% of the total habitat, and on a annual base that should be less than 10%. And what they mean by affected is that levels are higher than what they call lobe, and this lobe is a kind of a term they coined as which means level for onset of adverse biological effects, which is an effect where for a certain species or a certain area that biological relevant effects are starting to occur. There's still a lot of discussion between countries how to adapt these or how to adopt this advice, but this is just kind of the trend that's happening in Europe. So with that, I want to finish. Just development of offshore wind is moving fast. There's large ambitions due to the need to get to alternative energy sources. I think the current focus is on a few sensitive species, but I think that we still have big questions to deal with. How we extrapolate this to new areas, new construction types, also how to accumulate this over different with different other nice important noise sources. And I think the key point is that extensive monitoring still will be required, and also adaptive management strategies are key to implement new insights. With that, I want to finish, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Sander. That was really informative. We have a little bit of time for some questions that are in the Q&A chat box. We have one from Patrick Lynn. Can you explain the difference between the US and EU categorization of impulsive sound? And how are these impulsive sounds defined or identified based on the MSFD and Deckling, as opposed to Southall et al.'s US definition, which defines sonar as non-impulsive?
Um, that's a good question. I think there hasn't been a direct comparison being made. I think the impulsive noise register approach, or the approach in Europe, they really look at more. They basically make a categorization between more continuous sounds like shipping, uh, which is more prevalent, and there's more concerns about masking. Whereas for these other sources, there's more concern about behavioral responses, where animals are being displayed for a certain period out of an area. And I think that's the reason for why, and they've made a categorization of, which sound sources will have substantial a potential for displacement in those areas. And I think that's how they came up with these sound sources, and that's also why they included sonar sounds in that. And they've used the term impulsive, but yeah, I think and that is just different from the way impulsive sound is being categorized in the Southall criteria.
Oh, thank you for your answer. In the interest of time, we're going to move on from the Q&A. Sandra, if you don't mind just letting me share my screen.
Sure. Should I stop sharing?
Yes, just stop your sharing, please. And to those of you who did post a question in the chat but haven't received an answer yet, our panelists and participants will answer those and send out a follow-up email. So once again, thank you to everyone, to all of our participants as well as our attendees. If you registered for this webinar over Zoom, keep an eye out for an email. There will be details in that email for filling out the questionnaire for the professional development certificate, as well as the Docets webinar survey. If you have any suggestions for how we can make these webinars better, please make your voice heard in that survey. We really appreciate your input. And then just as one final thing, this is the final webinar in the 2024 webinar series. So if you would like to go back and watch the 4 previous webinars from this year, you can watch them on the Docets website, as well as completing those questionnaires for each webinar. And if you complete all 4 of them by December 2nd, you will receive a professional development certificate from Docets. So go ahead, watch those. They were really informative. And yeah, thank you once again for everyone for joining today. This was, and thank you to our speaker, Sandra. This was a really great webinar.